I'll be reading from Daniel chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up."
Good morning, church. So right before I was coming up here, my wife leans into me and she says, "Are you ready?" And I'm sitting here and I'm going, well, it doesn't really matter if I am or not. Like, sermon's happening one way or the other. But interestingly enough, Paul had approached me about 3 weeks ago, and he said, he's going to be out and asked if I'd be willing to preach. And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And I was in this really unusual position that I had an idea right off the top of my head. It's not very common for me with this stuff. And I thought, yeah, I've got an idea. I have an idea where I'm going to go with it. No problem. And so for the last 3 weeks, I've been working on variation of this topic. And I had some examples that I was going to touch on, some things that I wanted to address, and I was pumped about it. I had talked to my dad about it. I talked to my mom about it yesterday on the phone at what time did you call, 6 o'clock? Sarah's heard about it unendingly. And then at 10:30, 11 o'clock last night, I was looking at it, and I'm like, I'm not going to do that. Wiped it all out, and we'll start over again. So. But I've actually, kind of landed on something I think will be a lot more meaningful, that we can draw a lot more lessons from. I found it fitting that Greg, you were talking about Thomas Jefferson, and you had also made a Julius Caesar reference, which I thought was quite nice, and it ties in nicely because we're going to talk about a little bit of history today, and the church fell asleep. But no. I wanted to talk about, it's actually a couple of individuals, but one in particular that I learned about when I was a senior in high school. I was taking an English class, and my teacher showed us this movie called A Man for All Seasons, and we'll get into what that was about in a minute here, but it was one of those kind of monumental moments in your education. You have one of those classes, you have one of those teachers that just brings something to you that resonates, and it winds up sticking with you your whole life. And this, for me, is one of those situations. And it's about a man named Thomas More. But to get there, we have to talk about somebody else first. And that is Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the King of England in the 16th century. As you might recall, he desperately sought a male heir to succeed him on the throne. But his efforts with Queen Catherine had proven largely unsuccessful. Believing the Queen to be at fault, Henry sought to annul his marriage, which was highly problematic for the Catholic king because the Pope was not going to grant an annulment on such grounds. In response to this, Henry did something rather bold, and he decided to break away completely from the Roman Catholic Church and seized all the church's assets in the region and named himself supreme head of the newly formed Church of England. Though he claimed divine authority to do what he did, Henry still encountered significant opposition, and people came out voicing their concerns. But as a result, Henry responded with a campaign of suppression to bend resistors to his will. One such resistor was Thomas More. Now, Thomas More was a prominent lawyer. He was an author, philosopher, statesman, and counselor to the king, actually. At one point, he was serving as the king's high chancellor, very high position. to hold. So he was very well respected, highly regarded both among the aristocracy as well as among the peasants, both for his brilliant mind and his unwavering commitment to his faith. Though Thomas acknowledged the queenship of Henry's new wife, Anne Boleyn, he had refused to attend the coronation ceremony, and that was largely viewed among the people as a snub, and so the king took action against him. At the crux of the issue was not the marriage itself, but rather the issue of authority and whether or not the king could truly claim power that, according to Catholic doctrine, rested solely with the Pope. And I do recognize it's a little ironic that I'm giving a sermon on Catholicism and Catholic doctrine, but it works, I promise. But like I said, the crux of the issue was not the marriage itself, but just the matter of authority and who possessed it. Now, Thomas More could not be moved from his position, and the king, unaccustomed to hearing the word no, began a campaign to bend Thomas to his will. Henry tried to discredit Thomas's character and credibility among the people by raising false charges of conspiracy and taking bribes, but due to lack of evidence in any instance, the courts really had nothing that they could do. Finally, though, the king found his opening when he issued the oath of supremacy and decreed that his subjects must swear to it or risk being charged with treason. The language of the oath confirmed Henry as head of the newly formed Church of England, with divine authority that no longer belonged to the Roman papacy. Though most of his family and associates wound up taking the oath, Thomas himself refused, and in doing so, finally gave his enemies sufficient cause for charges of treason. He was arrested. He was put on trial before a panel of judges that just so happened to include the new queen's father, her brother, as well as her uncle. So not exactly an impartial jury. After the deliberations were complete, it only took 15 minutes for the panel to find Thomas More guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to death by beheading. Before his execution, Thomas had one last act of defiance left. As he stood on the scaffold awaiting his fate, he boldly declared that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. I'd like to tell you that Thomas More's death served as a catalyst for change, and that people, like at the end of Braveheart, rallied around his cause and brought about a victory in death that he couldn't achieve in life. And the reality, and a sad one at that, is that nothing really changed. The people went back about their business. The king was still the king. He was still head of the Church of England, and he continued his pursuit of a male heir as if nothing had happened. If we're being honest with ourselves, and we take a good long look, we would see that the world that we live in today, especially when it comes to governments and authorities, including our own, really isn't much different than how it was 500 or even 5,000 years ago. Now, certainly, a constitutional republic like ours is not the same in its structure or its form as the monarchy of Thomas More's time, nor is it similar to the kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar ruled over in the book of Daniel. But just like those examples, governments and institutions today still make claims to power and authority that aren't theirs to claim. And all too often, people are content to submit even when those powers that be are in direct conflict with the supreme authority that belongs solely to God. We hear stories like that of Thomas More, and we may even be rightly humbled or inspired by the steadfastness of his faith against an insurmountable force. Yet too many times we are so caught up in the things of this world that we compromise ourselves without proper consideration for the consequences that we may face in the next. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that was just read is an important one, and not because of the outcome that we're so familiar with. I deliberately cut it off before we get to the outcome, but because of the lesson that it teaches us about the importance of faith, character, and a willingness to stand for what's right despite the outcome. So let's do a little backtracking. Look at Daniel as a whole as we lead up to this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. At the beginning of the book of Daniel, God's people find themselves once again in transition. The Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, had sacked Judah and brought back some of the sons of Israel to serve in the king's palace. Among them was Daniel, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And chapter 1, verse 2, if you have your Bibles, makes an important distinction about the nature of Nebuchadnezzar's victory over the Israelites. It states that the Lord gave the king of Judah into his hands. From the very outset, the author is making a definitive claim that authority rests solely with Yahweh. Though the victory is certainly Nebuchadnezzar's to enjoy, it was not by his own power, but God's will that Judah would come under the king's influence. And right there is a valuable lesson to be learned, that even in times of darkness and struggle, even when it seems like God's presence is lacking, we must be open to the very real possibility that God has us exactly where he wants us to be. Shortly after arriving in Babylon, two conflicts arise involving the king and his new Israelite subjects. The first conflict, really was quite innocuous. As a perk of serving the king, Daniel and his men are given a portion of the king's food and wine. Eating it, though, would have defiled the Israelites, and instead, in what is probably every mother's dream, Daniel strikes a deal so that he and his men can have vegetables and water instead. I refer to vegetables as the food that my food eats. So this is a strange concept for me. You actually want vegetables? All right, cool, whatever. But the master of officials with whom Daniel was speaking is understandably concerned what the reaction of the king might be if the men aren't properly nourished. But after a short testing period, it's found that the Israelites are actually in better condition than those that ate the king's portion. By choosing to abstain from eating the king's food, Daniel is making it clear that though they may be subjects to the king, they must still set themselves apart from the culture. Likewise, the author establishes that while the king can provide food and wine from the spoils of his conquests, it is only God who is able to provide nourishment. The second conflict has to do with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Shortly after the food incident, Nebuchadnezzar has a nightmare, and it concerns him so much that he issues a command to all of the magicians, the astrologers, and the sorcerers to provide an interpretation. And when they all prove to be unsuccessful, in his anger, the king issues another command to kill all the wise men of Babylon. And this is a population that just so happens to include the newly acquired Israelites. Now, as I was reading over this a number of times in the last couple of weeks, this one observation kept popping up in my head, and it doesn't necessarily have, it's just something that I thought was interesting. Notice that none of the magicians, astrologers, or sorcerers tried to lie to the king. I find that to be very fascinating. I mean, how hard would it have been to just make something up and say, well, it means this, or it means this? Like, how's he going to know? By what basis would the king know if they were lying or not? But for some reason, they don't. And I have a theory about it. I don't know if I'd be able to prove it or have any way of knowing I'm right or wrong, but my theory about this is that the king's wise men are too baffled by the vision and equally baffled by their inability to interpret it. And that bafflement that they have renders them completely unable to even consider trying to lie. They're literally dumbfounded. They're like, oh, I have no idea what that means. And just owned up to it right away. I think that they truly believed that they had sufficient power to interpret the dream. And when confronted with the truth, they were too overwhelmed to even try and pull a fast one on the king. I find that fascinating. Chapter 2, verse 10 documents the response of the king's wise men to the king. And it reads, "There is not a man on the earth who can tell the king's matter, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Also, it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is no one else who can tell it before the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." Interestingly, the Chaldeans are tacitly acknowledging that there are forces at play beyond the capacity of man to know or to control. God's authority in Babylon is gradually being made known. Daniel then is able to submit a request to interpret the dream, and he finds himself finally in front of the king. If the Chaldeans' comments about the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh were unclear to the king, Daniel provides unequivocal clarity. He tells the king in verse 37, "You, O king, are the king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power and strength and glory. Wherever the sons of men dwell, or the animals of the field, or the fowl of the heavens, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are a head of gold. In other words, King Nebuchadnezzar, I'd like to introduce you to God. When the king hears Daniel's interpretation, his reaction is actually completely positive. He tells Daniel in verse 47, "Truly, your God is God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." He promotes Daniel and showers him with gifts. Meanwhile, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also receive promotions, and it appears that all is well in Babylon, or at least on its way. If this were a movie, the music would be playing, the credits would start rolling. At the end of chapter 2, it seems like there is reason to be hopeful that things will turn around for the children of Israel. As I was reading this, I thought, and the first thought that kind of popped into my head was, I was actually remembering shortly after 9/11. I remember after the attacks that church attendance across the country exploded. And you may remember Congress held vigils on the steps of the Capitol building while singing hymns. People had no problem calling on the name of Jesus in reverence, and not as a punchline to a joke. But I also distinctly remember at that time having this sense of trepidation as I watched those events, because I knew, and I think if we're being honest, most of us probably knew, that that moment of renewed religious fervor in the country was not going to last. And sure enough, it didn't. Many people that had sought out church for comfort found little use for it once the initial shock of the attacks wore off. Many of the members of Congress who were supposedly so united together went back to the business of opposition. And many of those who were so eager to call on the name of Jesus in the aftermath of a tragedy turned hostile toward those of us who never stopped. Whatever Nebuchadnezzar had taken away from Daniel's interpretation of his dream, it definitely didn't stick, and things go south. Immediately following the interpretation, the king makes an image of gold and issues a decree that when the music plays, everyone must fall down and worship. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of course, refused to do so, which brings us current with this morning's reading. That might seem like a lot of buildup, might seem like a lot of foundation laying and establishing context of the men coming into conflict with the king. But I wanted to do that because it serves some really important points. The first is that the confrontation between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the king did not occur randomly or out of thin air. You know, when we learn this story as kids, we just tell the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. But it's not very often that when we're young and we're first hearing it that we're telling the whole story about Daniel from the beginning, leading up to that. It just kind of seems like these guys live in Babylon, and the king just gets mad, and that there's no other context that we have to go off of. But this didn't happen randomly or out of thin air. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been consistent from the very beginning about who they were, what their values were, and under whose authority they were truly subject. The king should not have been shocked nor surprised, especially given the fact that literally just one chapter prior, he had acknowledged Yahweh as a God of gods and Lord of kings. The only thing that we can rightly assume, I believe, in regards to the king's reaction is that God's power and authority were totally fine as long as it didn't interfere with his own. What he could not possibly understand was that there was no worse consequence the men could suffer than to abandon the faith and the trust that they had in God. They fearlessly declared to him, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." Notice something here. The men, notice the qualifier in verse 17. If it be so. The men are confident in their deliverance. Though they're confident in their deliverance, their decision not to worship the image is not dependent on the guarantee of their safekeeping. If it be so. And though they acknowledge God's ability to rescue them, in verse 18, they render that a moot point completely by basically saying, hey, listen, God's going to get us out of this, but even if we wind up cooking like marshmallows, we're still not caving into this. Regardless of the consequences, the men were prepared to give all for their Lord. Though it may not always seem like it, we are very much living in times of increasing confrontation for the same reasons as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Despite the lip service that gets paid to God and religious liberty, our society and our leaders have crafted their own golden images and demand that people of faith bow down and pay tribute, even when it comes into direct conflict with our values, beliefs, and God's ultimate authority. In recent weeks, you've probably been seeing a lot of news stories about transgender bathrooms. If you had asked me 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, if I thought that this would be an issue that we would be dealing with, I would have said unequivocally yes. I actually kind of knew this was coming. I'd had conversations with my dad about this a long time, and at the time we thought we were kind of joking about it. We're like, well, this is probably what's going to happen next. And it did. So we're just going to stop talking about that stuff because maybe we're causing it to happen. But in recent weeks, a number of state legislatures have been debating various bills aimed at developing policies surrounding the use of bathrooms by people who identify as transgender. Now, some states were seeking exclusion from certain bathrooms, whereas others were simply seeking exemptions for religious institutions who did not want to violate their beliefs. Now, the reactions in the different states have been varied, but one publication in Tennessee, pulled no punches, claiming that the bills on the issue are being, I quote, introduced in legislatures around the country as conservative Christians, upset by advances in gay rights in the courts, have started taking out their frustrations on transgender people. Let's follow that twisted logic here for a second. If you happen to support any of the new bills about which bathroom transgender people ought to use, it's not because of public safety or mental health concerns or even legitimate religious beliefs. It's just because Christians are mad about gay rights and we've decided to get revenge. Let's be very clear about what's really going on. The issue at hand isn't about bathrooms, but the fact that society has crafted a golden image that some Christians are refusing to bow down to, and secular society wants to throw them hypothetically or figuratively speaking, I should say, into the furnace. And this bathroom issue is just one in an increasingly long line of conflicts that continue to be played out in our country. For instance, if you oppose abortion, according to society, it's not because you see divine value in human life, but because you're a misogynist and trying to legislate women's bodies, which I find an interesting criticism, as many women are pro-life. We should just bow down and let people do whatever they want, regardless of whether or not our doing so forces us to compromise our values and our beliefs. If you own a business and do not support the healthcare mandate to provide certain types of contraceptives, not all, mind you, just certain types, according to society, your business should be boycotted or preferably run completely out of business. We should just bow down and let people do whatever they want, regardless of the compromise it would require. If you own a bakery or a photography business and do not support the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage, according to society, you should be forced to comply or have your business license revoked for discrimination and bigotry, regardless of whether or not there is a higher authority to which you appeal that dictates your worldview. The critical question for all of these issues is this: to which kingdom do we belong? To put it a different way, do we submit to the powers of this world, or do we instead step into the furnace? Do we trust that regardless of the consequences, we can step out in faith with eternal confidence that that which is wrong in this life will be made right by God's hand in the next? While Thomas More was in prison, these were questions that he wrestled with in a number of his letters and writings. In one of the last letters that he wrote before his execution, Thomas spoke of his choice to defy the king for the sake of his conscience and beliefs, writing, "My case was such in this matter, through the clearness of my own conscience, that though I might have pain, I could not have harm. For a man may, in such a case, lose his head and still not have harm. We believe and we know that our God is a God of miracles, that the one who commanded all creation into existence with just a spoken word possesses the capacity to display his infinite wonders in pursuit of proclaiming his power and authority. We also believe and we know that God may choose to withhold his wonders so that we, his faithful servants, can proclaim his power and authority through the very lives we live when we choose to speak up and when we refuse to bow down. In proclaiming that power, our lives may indeed be called upon, but we can act with faith and courage, resting soundly in the knowledge that there is no power on heaven or earth, no kings or kingdoms, no threats or punishments of man that can dim the bright future that waits us when God's heavenly kingdom is made manifest through all eternity. We possess the hope of a future where God reigns supreme, and all darkness, all sadness, all pain are transformed into victorious joy, the culminating experience of a broken world that has once again been made whole. If this is not yet the future that you see, or if you are struggling to stand courageously in the furnace, there are people here who can help and would love to talk with you and help you on your journey. We invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.